between life in the U.S. after World War I and life in the U.S. after World War II. Of course, the 1950s are a very different time than the 1920s, with anxieties built on Cold War fears and a world built on connection and technology. But there were some key similarities. In both cases, Americans returned home seeking a normal life and experiencing a level of prosperity that allowed them to do just that. And in both cases, Americans feared difference, feared groups that seemed un American, and acted on those fears in ways that proved problematic. And in both cases, as we'll see, the changes of the war led to social transformations for groups like African Americans and women. So let's spend some time in the post war US and think about how that period shaped American life. As in the 1920s, the end of the war brought with it an economic boom. Much of the factories and industries producing for the war transitioned back to peacetime, and they found that a combination of global demand and pent up domestic demand in the US, because for the first time since 1929 there was no depression or wartime rationing, led to a boom in which people could use their newfound money to buy stuff. The Cold War helped. Especially by the 1950s, the focus on military spending and defense buildups meant jobs and paychecks. In fact, one of the places that did the best in the Cold War was a place that had been overlooked through much of the 20th century, the South. During World War II, powerful Southern politicians in the Democratic Party encouraged Franklin Roosevelt to build defense facilities in southern states as a way to spread out government investment. When the war ended, private industries followed suit, finding the South to be amenable to investment. Southerners were earned less than any other group in the country. They were cheap to hire. They were less likely to join unions. And Southern governments were willing to provide tax breaks and other incentives to encourage growth. And we should also note that the widespread adoption of the air conditioner made working in the South year-round available. In the 1950s, the South, parts of the Southwest were being referred to as the Sun Belt, an area experiencing rapid economic growth. Companies located or relocated to the Sun Belt, bringing with them hundreds and thousands of people, hiring hundreds more. The decade of the 1950s saw the South become more urban, more suburban, and more middle class. One of the best examples of this is in Alabama, the city of Huntsville. Before World War II, Huntsville was a dying cotton textile mill center. But during World War II, Alabama senators convinced the government to locate a government arsenal in the city. When the war ended, the Army turned the facility into a rocket and missile research plant. Soon after, NASA created a space center there. The rockets, led by a German emigre named Wernher von Braun, pioneered missile warfare, space flight, but also brought in a lot of contract companies working with the arsenal, with the space center, like General Electric, IBM, Boeing, all of whom brought big bucks, technicians, hired people, and pumped that money back into the economy. This kind of economy, a space-age military economy, was unknown in the South before the war. We should also note that in the 1950s, unlike the 1920s, the federal government played a role in facilitating economic growth and the prosperity that occurred. Let's look at a couple of examples of that. One of the best examples occurred in 1944, the last full year of the war, when the U.S. government passed a piece of legislation called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights. Usually just call it the GI Bill. It was designed to help war veterans transition into peacetime life. But it also shows us what Americans expected normal life to look like in an age of prosperity. The GI Bill provided funds for education for veterans who were honorably discharged. Those funds for education helped about 8 million vets go to college. And it also encouraged kind of a sense that college was expected for young people. The GI Bill also provided assistance for veterans looking for work. It gave veterans access to government-funded health care, even provided mortgage assistance so vets could buy a home. Another good example of the way that the government encouraged such growth was an action taken by Dwight Eisenhower in 1956 when he created the interstate highway system. With an initial funding of $25 billion that paid 90% of interstate costs, the system was reminiscent of New Deal public works jobs, where people went to work on jobs building infrastructure for the government. But it was also an economic incentive, since it made transportation easier, it helped commerce flow through the country, and as you might notice, lots of businesses flocked to places where the interstate was. In both cases, we have a Democrat, Roosevelt, and a Republican, Eisenhower, using the power of the government to push forward the economy. That widespread prosperity led to another significant change in American home life, a demographic explosion. Beginning in 1946, the population of the U.S. exploded thanks to a phenomenon we call the baby boom. Since the outset of the Great Depression, the U.S. birth rate had declined due to economic hardship, and then when the war, young men were sent overseas. When families were reunited and when they were relatively confident about the state of their finances, they started having children. It led to over 70 million children being born between 1946 and 1961, the baby boom generation, or about one every 7 seconds at its height. As the population skewed younger, it reshaped the United States. Families with young children and good jobs were consumers. They bought TVs and cars, they went on trips and went out to eat. It encouraged a boom in the consumer economy, which further fueled the post-war boom. But that growing population needed one thing specifically: living space. And there was a problem. There weren't houses available. In the wake of the Depression, when no one could afford to build a home, in World War II, when building materials were rationed, the U.S. was experiencing a housing shortage. Traditional solutions like urban apartments or aging streetcar suburbs couldn't cut it. And so the solution to this was the brainchild of a real estate developer named William Levitt. During the war, Levitt had designed affordable, easy-to-build housing for the Navy. He applied techniques of mass production and assembly line, and so he could churn out a basic 720 square foot house with a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a bath, a living room, and an attic, and sell it for about $7,000. The affordability of the house was matched by the affordability of the land. Levitt located his houses several miles outside of major cities. The land was cheap since it wasn't reached by existing streetcars, but with automobiles and new highways, it was commutable. The first development was on Long Island, about 40 miles east of New York City. There, Levitt built over 17,000 houses on 6,000 acres. The town, called Levittown, was the first of what we would call a suburb. The idea caught on, and between 1948 and 1958, the vast majority of new homes built in the United States, 11 of 13 million, were built in suburbs. And by 1960, a third of the nation lived in suburbs. Suburban living quickly came to exemplify the prosperity of the post-war period. Every family could afford a little house with a little yard. They could buy stuff to fill up that house, from appliances to decorations, and live a comfortable life with a husband and wife, a couple kids, a pet or two. They could put a car in the garage that they could use to commute to a good-paying job. Suburbs seemed removed from the dirty, cramped industrial cities. And pretty soon, suburbs had their own stores, their own school systems, their own amenities. When Cold War Americans talked about the benefits of life in a capitalistic economy, they pointed to the image of suburbia. But we need to be careful in thinking about suburbia in the 1950s as a story of success and contentment. In fact, there are 3 areas in which suburbia was marked by inequality and even opposition. The first is in terms of race. Many suburban developers actively excluded non-white families from purchasing homes. In fact, William Levitt specifically excluded black buyers from Levittown. Even after such explicit discrimination was outlawed, realtors refused to sell homes or lots in white suburbs to black buyers. In 1953, Levittown had 70,000 residents, none of whom were black. Yet black families experienced the baby boom as well, and they too sought affordable housing. But because they were excluded from suburban communities, they found that the only places left available in most cities were either inner-city apartment blocks or the old streetcar suburbs now being abandoned. This process became known as white flight, as white families fled to newly built suburbs, leaving crumbling and crowded cities to minorities. Such segregation, even though it wasn't maintained by law, shaped American life. White families with better paying jobs contributed more in tax money to their suburban communities, which soon had better facilities. Black workers who continued to suffer the effects of pay and promotion discrimination, who were paid less in taxes, thus couldn't afford improvements. The racial divide was increasingly clear. A second area of discontent came within suburbia. Remember that during World War II, women had stepped up as Rosie Riveters to contribute to the war effort. But post-war demobilization of the Army and Navy, which brought young men back into the workforce, combined with the demand for the return to normal life, created a lot of pressure on women to assume a more traditional role. And pop culture reasserted these roles. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Reed Show, here's Donna Reed in this presentation, focused on women as stay-at-home mothers and homemakers. happy and content to allow their husband to work. This social pressure encouraged women to marry, have children, and evacuate the workforce. One women's magazine, House Beautiful, told women to, quote, fit your husband's home to him and forget your own preferences while paying attention to his. Now, to be clear, a lot of women continued to work. They made up as much as a third of the workforce in the 1950s, but few women found professional, good paying jobs. Less than 15% of teachers, of nurses, accountants, and social workers were women, and even fewer attorneys and doctors were. Now, of course, many women embraced the role of housewife and enjoyed it, but many women also wanted more. They wanted professional jobs, college degrees, or even a different kind of life, but the expectations of the 1950s and the reality of life in the suburbs limited what women could do. The final group we should discuss, and some of the most vocal critics of suburbia, weren't excluded African Americans or unhappy housewives. They were artists, writers, poets, and musicians who rejected the notion that happiness was getting married, living in a house like your neighbor, and buying more stuff. Called the Beatniks or the Beats, this group criticized the way that suburban 1950s were marked by conformity. Instead of doing what everyone else they argued, people should find their own spark. They had to embrace their individuality. One of the most famous writers of the Beats was Jack Kerouac. In his books, like On the Road, Kerouac wrote about living a life of abandon, traveling instead of settling down, seeking out new experiences, embracing spontaneity. He talked about cross-country road trips in which he experimented with drugs and alcohol, listened to jazz, drove fast cars, had girlfriends, all without a desire to settle down into normality. In a lot of ways, the Beats were the forerunners of the social rebellions of the 1960s. Americans associated prosperity and domestic contentment with the strength of the U.S. in the Cold War and the power of democratic capitalism. They also thought that communism as a threat wasn't just international, it was domestic. It was a threat to suburbia. And so when Americans thought about containment, it wasn't just about stopping the spread into Europe or Asia, it was also about stopping communism at home. This led to a second, more intense Red Scare than in the 1920s. And it began in the years after World War II. President Truman instituted loyalty oaths and pledges for federal workers. These gradually extended to other parts of the private and public sector. If you wanted a job, you had to promise you had no connection or association with any kind of communist organization. But in 1949, the shocks of the Soviet bomb and the fall of China put a lot of pressure on Truman. It looked like a failure of containment, and many believe that such failures happened because communists had infiltrated and weakened the American government. In fact, it was pretty soon clear that some of the information the Soviets used to build their bomb was the result of spies in the Manhattan Project. And so by 1950, American politics increasingly revolved around anti-communism, as both Republicans and Democrats stressed their anti-communist chops and accused their opponents of being soft on communism. And one politician in particular was at the center of this debate, a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. In the midst of a tough campaign in 1950, McCarthy gave a speech in which he flashed a piece of paper and said, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party." McCarthy didn't have a list, and his claim was a blatant fabrication, but his accusation that communists were infiltrating the American government and hurting the U.S.'s efforts to win the Cold War struck a chord. He won re-election. He began heading up a series of very public congressional hearings in which he and his colleagues in the House of Representatives called in accused communists and communist sympathizers, grilled them, and tried to get them to name fellow communists. These accusations were very difficult to shake. As you can imagine, anyone named as a communist was assumed to be guilty and suffered a hurt reputation. Moreover, the best way to avoid criticism or jail time in a lot of cases was to name names, deflect blame onto someone else. Very few politicians were willing to confront him. Democrats, who were painted as soft on communism, found it impossible to speak out without drawing attention to themselves and to the losses of the Truman administration. Republicans, McCarthy's own party, disliked him, but because his hearings strengthened their political chances, that helped them be seen as hard on communism, none of them spoke out. Even Dwight Eisenhower, who won the presidency during McCarthy's campaigns, refused to condemn him. To be fair, his hearings occasionally uncovered a Russian spy. The most notorious were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, although their story is fairly tragic and shows some of the complications of such a way of going after supposed communists. The Rosenbergs had been Communist Party members in the 1940s, and in the summer of 1950, the FBI arrested them and charged them with participating in a plot to send information on the atomic bomb to the Soviets. Ethel's brother had worked at Los Alamos and had admitted to the FBI that he had helped the Rosenbergs pass information. Historians are pretty sure that Julius did just that. He passed scientific and technical information on the bomb and other weapons to Moscow. But they're also pretty sure that Ethel was innocent. And in fact, Ethel was probably charged in the first place just to force Julius to confess. Instead, both Rosenbergs insisted on their innocence. The court convicted them of treason, and in 1953 executed them in the electric chair. All of these hearings, all of these trials were public. People followed them in the paper, debated guilt or innocence. Seeing the Rosenbergs, who looked like an average couple, led people to believe that anybody could be a Soviet agent. It made people skeptical of their neighbors, friends, or colleagues, anyone who displayed odd behaviors. Now again, spies were exceedingly rare, and the vast majority of people accused, questioned, imprisoned were innocent and harmless. By 1952-1953, the spirit of anti-communism, increasingly now called McCarthyism, was spreading. State-level hearings and trials, local accusations, people who were accused faced personal and professional harassment, fired, books are banned, movies were censored, all for being communistic. But in 1954, McCarthy's downfall began. When a very popular newscaster named Edward R. Murrow ran an expose on McCarthy. Murrow showed McCarthy to be crass and vulgar, and he noted examples of McCarthy's willingness to dismiss facts, to play on sensationalism. He pointed to the fact that McCarthy had never produced any sort of evidence for what he was claiming. Murrow was one of the most respected public figures in America, and the fact that he spoke out against McCarthy encouraged Americans to think more critically of the congressman. And soon after that, McCarthy went too far. He accused a young dentist in the Army of having communist sympathies and criticized the Army leadership for ignoring them. The Army McCarthy hearings, as they were called, were aired live on television with about 25 million viewers. They saw McCarthy's cruelty in person, his badgering of witnesses. He was a bully. And so when the public turned on him, so did his colleagues. Eisenhower denounced McCarthy, and soon after, the Senate censured him for, quote, unbecoming contact. He lost his seat, he began drinking heavily, and died 3 years later. But anti-communism never went away. Americans remained suspicious of subversive forces and still used communist and red as insults, as threats. This climate of fear lasted through the rest of the Cold War. To be clear here, McCarthy's fall ensured that this overwhelming pressure of accusations, hearings, trials became less common. But the vague threat of communism, the notion of spies and subversives, hung around. Anti-communism was one of the issues that dominated politics in the 1950s. The other was civil rights. Just as the prosperity of the 1950s brought attention to communism as a challenge to that prosperity, the inequality of suburban life highlighted the continued problem of racism in the U.S., particularly in the South. After World War II, African Americans hoped to build on wartime gains and push against racial segregation in the South. And there were some hints of improvement. Thanks to their wartime contributions, President Truman desegregated the armed forces, and in 1948, Truman even committed the Democratic Party to addressing civil rights. But within that party, Southern Democrats were strongly opposed to any challenge to segregation. And in fact, when Truman announced the Democratic Party would seek to study the issue of civil rights, Southern Democrats actually walked out of the nominating convention in protest. Republicans, too, were very hesitant to challenge segregation. When he became president, Eisenhower was unwilling to use government power to address inequality. Instead, he thought the best response would be to let Southerners work out their own problems, in fact, ensuring that nothing happened. Then, in 1954, the Supreme Court handed down the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. The case was the result of decades of work by the NAACP and its legal team, who had slowly challenged segregation by showing that in the South, in education, separate schools were not equal and did not provide an equal educational experience. In Brown, the NAACP argued that when students were divided by race, African Americans received an inferior education and inferior treatment. In a unanimous ruling, the court said, separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Brown overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and the legal justification behind segregation. Even though Southerners immediately acted to resist the ruling, in some cases even threatening to close schools to prevent desegregation, Brown was a statement of government support for integration. And in late 1955, a little over a year after Brown, the iconic civil rights movement began in Montgomery. The NAACP had been active in Montgomery looking for a way to challenge segregation. Inspired by Brown in the sense that the government was moving on civil rights, a seamstress and an NAACP member named Rosa Parks violated segregation ordinances on city buses when she refused to move back to accommodate a white passenger. She was arrested, and her arrest sparked a court case that eventually made it to the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, local leaders wanted to maintain pressure on the city government, wanting to make sure that Montgomery would abide by a Supreme Court ruling overturning segregation. So they organized a boycott in which black residents would refuse to ride city buses. The leaders then made a fateful decision. In the hopes of motivating the boycotters and maintaining enthusiasm, they turned for help from a young pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in the city, Martin Luther King Jr. King was a passionate and arresting speaker who early on developed a clear vision of how African Americans should work for civil rights. He was a proponent of nonviolent civil protest, refusing to obey unjust laws like segregation while responding to pressure with Christian love and charity. He wanted to create a moral force that people couldn't ignore, and the boycott fit that vision perfectly. Protesters quickly faced opposition from segregationists. Police harassed boycotters as they walked and marched. Other proponents of segregation turned to violence, assaulting the boycotters and leaders. King's home was bombed. But in 1956, the Supreme Court struck down segregation ordinances on city buses. And under pressure from King and others, Montgomery compromised on bus seating, a clear victory for a growing civil rights movement. King followed Montgomery by founding an organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. SCLC embraced King's philosophy and methods, nonviolent protests to bring public pressure on government to change. Following Montgomery, King set up offices in Atlanta and began traveling the country, building money and support for SCLC. At the same time, the victory in Montgomery convinced Southern whites to step up their opposition to segregation. We call this massive resistance, and it took two forms. Violent resistance to desegregation was embodied by a revived Ku Klux Klan, which supported the use of violence in order to discourage, injure, or even kill civil rights workers. The second wing was a more professional resistance in which white community leaders worked to halt the gains of the civil rights movement, embodied by white citizens' councils or citizens' councils. These were groups made up of business leaders, politicians, and attorneys who used their power and influence to protect segregation and prosecute activists, or protect individuals who were fighting against civil rights. Citizens Council members fired people involved in protests, publicized names, worked to halt civil rights legislation. Massive resistance ensured that civil rights would be a slow, hard fight. Like the 1920s, the 1950s were a decade of contrasts. The stability of prosperity and suburbia, with the anxiety of McCarthyism and civil rights. Americans had hope for the new decade, beginning in 1960, that the prosperity and stability would continue, the anxiety would fade away. But in a lot of ways, the decade of the 1960s would prove more turbulent and more anxiety-ridden. We're going to spend some time in the 1960s, beginning in the next lecture.